Once upon a time, in the highest part of an old creaking house, there sat a forgotten attic, the kind with slanted ceilings and crooked wooden beams, dust dancing through light shafts like sleepy snowflakes. Cobwebs sagged between forgotten trunks. A single window, smudged with time, peeked out over a sleeping village. No one came here anymore. Not since the last child had grown up and the laughter had faded into memory. And then came the wind. It didn't knock. Never does. Just a curious breeze, meandering like it always did through branches and open fields. This time it wandered upward, up the broken shingles past rusted nails, and through a crack in the window frame no one had bothered to seal. The attic exhaled a groan, as if surprised to have company. The wind, barely more than a sigh, explored slowly. It skimmed over brittle papers, stirred the ends of a forgotten scarf, and paused. There, resting in the farthest corner, was something long, curved, and silent. Violin. Not cradled, not displayed, just there, sleeping beneath a blanket of dust. Its strings sagged with age, its wooden skin dulled with neglect. But something about it made the wind stop moving. The wind for once stood still. And then it drifted forward ever so lightly, brushing a single string, accidentally perhaps. And in the silence of that attic, something marvelous happened. Sound. The faintest hum of a note. But it was enough. The wind pulled back, startled. Hadn't meant to play. But now it was intrigued. What else might happen? If it tried again. The violin didn't answer. It simply lay there as it always had. Silent, dusty, disinterested. The wind, having stirred a note, expected something more. But the attic was quiet again, as if that single sound had never happened. Only the occasional creak of the rafters replied, like the house clearing its throat and going back to sleep. Still the wind circled. It twisted softly around the violin's body, inspecting it the way a child inspects a seashell. Curious, gentle, unsure. The wood was dry but not cracked. The bow had long since fallen between two floorboards. Its strings drooped with age, but they still held tension, however faint. No wonder it hadn't played in years. No one had asked it to. The wind gave a tiny sigh, ruffling a pile of sheet music that lay curled nearby, the ink smudged from some long-forgotten rainy day. Names of old songs peeked out. Waltz for Autumn, Midnight Reverie, Lullaby in D. The wind didn't know what they meant, but it liked the sound of the words. It moved back toward the violin, unsure. Could something this old, this ignored, still make music? Or had it been forgotten for a reason? The wind brushed another string. This time it was deliberate, and the result was a low, growling tone. Not beautiful, yet not broken. It made the wind pause again. If the violin were alive, perhaps this was its breath. The wind circled once more, slower this time, stirring the air in careful spirals. But the violin did not respond. It was waiting. So the wind settled by the window, quiet now, wondering if a single note could still sleep inside this broken thing. What else might be hidden in its silence? The attic, though still and dusty, felt a little less empty. The wind returned the next afternoon. Not in a rush, not with force. Just a soft, curious breeze curling beneath the eaves, sliding once again through that same cracked window pane. It had thought about the violin all morning. Strange for a wind that rarely stayed in one place. But something about that old instrument lingered in its thoughts, like the echo of a melody not yet finished. Today the light in the attic was warmer. A golden slant cut across the wooden floor, making the dust sparkle like it had somewhere to be. The wind slipped in with a hush, as if not to wake anyone. It hovered near the violin. Still there. Still silent. The wind inched closer and blew across all four strings at once, softly like a sigh, like a secret. And the result? Chord. Barely held together, thin and airy, but unmistakably a chord. The notes didn't match perfectly. Some flat, some too sharp, some almost too tired to sing. But together they made something. The wind felt pleased. Not proud, not yet, but encouraged. Like a painter brushing color on a canvas and finding that, yes, the paint still sticks. The violin gave no thanks. No shiver of recognition. But the wind imagined it felt warmer beneath the dust. So the wind played again. A little higher this time. It teased the strings in different ways. Angled gusts, quick puffs, long flowing breaths. The attic turned into a quiet concert hall, empty save for two performers who had never met before. And when a particularly high note trembled against the window pane, the wind paused. The violin had responded. Just for a second, the strings vibrated with something like memory. Something old was waking up. The wind lingered, still as a held breath. That last note, it hadn't been a mistake. It had shimmered in the air, delicate but clear, like a candle flickering in the dark. The wind drifted closer, nudging the strings again, gentler this time. It wasn't about force. No, the wind was starting to learn this was about listening. Another soft stroke, and another faint sound emerged. The wind circled eagerly. It wasn't a song yet, but it was something. A whisper maybe. Or the beginning of one. The wind tried to coax the strings in a rhythm. Not music exactly, but more than noise. The notes that responded were uneven, uncertain, like someone waking up from a long, long sleep. But the wind could feel it. The violin was beginning to remember. And in a moment of stillness, after a slow, wavering note faded into the shadows, the wind realized something. The melody wasn't just coming from the strings. It was coming from the space around them. From the dust, the wood, the echoes baked into the walls. This attic had heard music before. Long ago. And now that music was finding its way back. The wind swept along a broken chair, brushed past a coat hook, and found itself back at the violin's side. It blew one steady, thoughtful gust across all the strings. The note that rose this time was deeper, fuller, as if the violin had sighed, not in sadness but in relief. The wind stayed still for a long while, letting that single sound settle. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a forgotten place at all. Maybe it had simply been waiting. The wind returned the next day with purpose. No longer a wandering breeze with idle curiosity. It was now a student of something ancient, something delicate. It swept through the familiar crack in the window like a friend returning home. The attic greeted it with its usual silence, but something in the stillness felt expectant. The violin waited in its corner. This time, the wind didn't rush to the strings. It circled first, taking in the space like a dancer studying the floor. The sunlight spilled across the room in lazy golden bands, warming the wood and making the dust sparkle like stars frozen in place. Then carefully the wind stirred. A low, humming note emerged. Then another, higher, softer. The wind shaped its movement like a conductor with invisible hands, playing not with speed, but with care. The violin trembled, its voice coming alive note by note. And suddenly, they danced. Not a song in full, no, this was still too shy, too fragile for a proper tune. But the rhythm had begun. The wind blew in playful circles, lifting loose pages from the floor, sending forgotten feathers spinning through the air. The violin answered each gust with a note, sometimes warm, sometimes cracked, always honest. There was no audience, no applause. Just two old souls meeting in the middle of a wooden room, speaking in the only language they had, sound. For the first time, the wind understood what it meant to coax rather than command. The violin didn't need fixing, didn't need tuning. It just needed someone to believe there was still music inside. And the wind, for all its formlessness, had finally found a shape it liked. The arc of a note, the curve of a bow never drawn, the hush between chords. Together, they had begun to dance. The attic changed. Not all at once, and not in a way you could measure with a ruler or a broom. But the air felt different now, lighter somehow. The stillness no longer weighed so heavily. Each time the wind visited, it left behind just a little more life. And the violin, it was waking. The wind began to notice something peculiar. After every new melody, the notes hung in the air a little longer, as if reluctant to leave. The echoes stretched like arms in a yawn, lingering in corners, nestling into the floorboards, painting invisible lines on the rafters. The attic began to hum. Faint, yes, but the kind of hum you feel in your chest. It wasn't the violin alone. It was the memory of music returning. The room had absorbed generations of sound. Lullabies from long-dead lullers, dance tunes for parties long disbanded, love songs that had once made someone blush. And now, when the wind brushed across the strings, it didn't just play. It remembered. The melodies it teased out weren't random anymore. They carried shape, themes, echoes of old patterns. A lullaby began to form, halting, clumsy, but recognizable. Phrase repeated, then adjusted. Chord reached for resolution. The wind followed the notes like stepping stones across a river. And in one suspended moment, the wind struck a chord that resonated just right. The entire attic responded. The walls, the beams, the floor, they didn't move. But they listened. The wind could feel it. The house remembered this song. Had heard it before long ago. Someone had played it here with love. The violin was no longer playing alone. It had found its home again. The violin's voice grew bolder. No longer just the hesitant whispers of a forgotten instrument. It now offered up tones with confidence. Soft, yes. Fragile always. But with meaning. Each note the wind summoned was clearer, stronger. As though the violin had shaken off a layer of sleep. The wind didn't push. Coaxed, it caressed. It learned which strings liked a swirling gust and which responded best to a steady breath. The violin, for its part, began to lean into the wind's presence, resonating faster, warmer. They were beginning to speak fluently now, not just in fragments. The attic, so long accustomed to dust and quiet, now carried the low hum of something alive. The wind ventured into the rafters, weaving between old cobwebs and stirring forgotten smells. Wood polish, candle wax, a hint of lavender sachets tucked inside yellowed drawers. Each scent seemed tied to a song. The wind let them guide it back to the violin, and with every return, it played differently. Sometimes wistful, sometimes mischievous. One afternoon, the wind coaxed a melody with such tender care that it brought forth a sound no one had heard in decades. Trill. Bright and brief, like laughter held in a string. The violin almost shivered with it. The wind paused in surprise, then rushed back in, giddy with delight. That trill, where had it come from? Memory. Instinct. It didn't matter. The violin had remembered joy. The wind answered with a rustle that swept through the attic like a giggle. And for one strange, beautiful moment, the whole room felt younger. The floorboards didn't creak, they tapped. The dust didn't settle, it twirled. The silence didn't return, it applauded. Music wasn't just coming back. It was coming alive. The wind, ever curious, wanted more. Not just from the violin, but from the room itself. What other secrets did this attic hold? It drifted away from the strings, letting them rest, and began its silent exploration with reverence. Every inch of the space was soaked in forgotten moments. Near the violin was a stack of old concert programs, edges curled and yellowed. The wind flipped one gently. Spring Recital, 1947. A name printed at the top, now faded but still legible. Eleanor Gray. The wind paused on that name. It had a melody in it. In a dusty trunk, it found a pair of child-sized ballet shoes. The ribbons stiff and faded. Along the edge of the trunk, faint scratches. A child's careful tally marks. Perhaps counting days. Or perhaps songs. The wind let the ribbons float up like ghosts of a performance. twirling once, then settling. It moved past a cracked mirror with a frame of peeling paint. The reflection showed the violin in its corner, bathed in warm light, almost regal in its silence. There were music sheets tucked under a broken chair leg. The wind nudged them free and found a handwritten score, ink smudged by time but legible. It wasn't famous. It wasn't perfect. But it was tender. A lullaby, likely played more for love than applause. The wind brought the sheet back to the violin. Not to show it, of course. The violin didn't see. But somehow, it remembered. The wind played again, now mimicking the notes from the lullaby. The strings hummed in agreement, recognizing the tune. It wasn't performance. It was reunion. Even the dust didn't settle now. It swirled in time. And the attic no longer felt abandoned, felt treasured. The wind didn't rush. Not anymore. It had learned that some things, especially beautiful things, take time. It circled back to the violin with the lullaby still rustling in its memory. This time, the strings responded before the wind even touched them, like the instrument had begun to anticipate the song. The first phrase was hesitant, but by the second, the violin leaned into it, its body humming with resonance. The wind danced in a wide arc, sweeping across the attic floor, lifting dust and feathers into a soft swirl. The notes weren't loud, not piercing, they were gentle, close to dreaming. And then, the violin did something unexpected. It played a phrase the wind hadn't prompted. Just 4 notes. Quiet, fragile, but unmistakably its own. The wind hesitated mid-spin. Was that real? The attic held its breath, as if it too had noticed. The wind returned quickly, brushing the strings again, gently nudging. The violin replied with another 4 notes, different this time, but with the same whisper of intent. The wind was no longer the only one guiding this music. The violin was speaking. It didn't need words. It didn't need to be held by hands or held aloft on a stage. Just needed to be heard. Together they played line by line, call and response. The wind gave breath, the violin gave voice. The attic was no longer a container for forgotten things. It was an instrument in itself, amplifying, resonating, joining in. A full phrase emerged. Song now. Soft, imperfect, trembling but true. And when the final note of that melody faded, the wind didn't fill the silence. Let it rest, because now even the silence was music. The wind rose, slow and deliberate. It circled high near the ceiling, coiling in the beams, as if to take in the whole space at once. Below, the violin waited, resting, content for now. The music between them had reached a new level, something less like performance and more like conversation. The wind drifted down again, ruffling a threadbare curtain that had long since stopped moving. Outside, the village rooftops shimmered in afternoon haze, unaware of the tiny concert blooming in the forgotten corners above. The wind blew gently across the strings, coaxing them once more. But this time something changed. The melody stretched longer. It lifted higher, soared. Notes leapt into the air as if they'd been waiting years to be heard again. The violin responded with warmth now, no longer shy, no longer reserved. Its tones filled the attic like perfume in a closed drawer. Slow, lingering, lovely. Passage emerged. Melodic, looping. The wind followed it, sculpting each note like a potter's hands around clay. The violin's sound shimmered, soft in the lows, luminous in the highs. The music was delicate but full. They had found each other's rhythm. And for the first time, the wind didn't feel like a visitor. Felt like a partner. Together, they played something that wasn't old, wasn't borrowed. This was new. Born of silence, carried by curiosity, shaped by time. The wind pressed closer, flowing around the violin's body in elegant spirals. The strings vibrated eagerly, singing with energy that hadn't existed in years. The attic glowed with the sound. Dust floated, sunbeams softened. Even the floorboards seemed to quiet themselves, not to interrupt. In a space where everything had once been forgotten, something beautiful was being created. It began with a waltz. 3 soft beats. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The wind had no feet, of course, but that didn't stop it from gliding in rhythm. It spun gently around the room, stirring the stale air into a graceful twirl. The violin responded instantly, offering up a lilting phrase that lifted like a dancer's arms. The melody wasn't grand, it was intimate, like the echo of a memory tucked in lace and dim candlelight. The kind of tune once played for a living room waltz, perhaps on a quiet evening when guests had gone and only the music remained. The wind coaxed the violin into the second verse. The notes dipped and swayed, some a little off-key from age, but all the more human for it. The attic became a ballroom of ghosts. Not haunting, not eerie, just full of presence. A warmth of what once was. The wind picked up tempo, and the violin followed. Not rushing, never rushing, but daring. The waltz grew bolder, steps surer. The light caught in floating dust like sequins in a gown. The cracked window, the worn beams, the creaky chair, they all faded into the background as the room became music. Outside, unnoticed by the players, the window let out a whisper of sound, just enough for the world below to catch a note. But inside the attic, the dance continued. The wind traced elegant loops around the violin, and the violin sang in return, high and lilting. It didn't matter that no one watched. The duet wasn't for an audience. It was for the joy of movement, for the memory of song, and for the quiet, defiant truth that even dust can dance. The music softened, slowing like a heartbeat at rest. The wind quieted its swirl, easing into a gentle breath that barely stirred the curtain now. The violin, still glowing from the waltz, released a final note that hung in the air like dew, trembling, waiting, then fading into silence. And in that silence, something stirred. Not in the strings, not in the wind, in the wood. The violin's body, long ignored, began to hum. Not a sound made from movement, but one felt in the bones. The wind hovered close and listened, not with ears but with presence. The hum was deep, nearly too low to notice, like the feeling of thunder before it rumbles. The wind traced the outline of the violin with careful grace, its current following the grain of the wood. Each curve carried a secret. Each nick and scratch told a tale. The wind didn't need to know the full stories to understand. They were all songs. Songs made not of notes, but of moments. A hand once rested here. A tear once fell there. A child once spun in circles, clutching it too tightly. And now an old friend, the wind, was helping it remember who it had been. The violin replied with no melody, but with resonance. A hum that pulsed through the attic, through the beams, through the quiet heart of the house itself. The wind paused. This was history. Not the kind carved in stone or written in books, but the kind that breathes inside forgotten things. Quiet kind, soft kind, the kind that only needs one listener to survive. And tonight the wind was listening. The attic, the violin, the silence. None of it was empty anymore. It was full. The wind drifted toward the window. Not to leave, just to look. The view hadn't changed much. The village below still slumbered beneath terracotta roofs and curling chimney smoke. A cat napped on a sun-drenched fence post. Laundry hung stiff in the late breeze. But now, the wind noticed something different. A child stood beneath the house, chin tilted up, eyes wide, listening. The wind stilled. Had the melody escaped, slipped through the window and caught an ear it wasn't meant for? Or perhaps it was meant. The wind retraced its path, brushing softly against the violin. No song this time, just a test. The string answered, not with volume but clarity, and as if on cue the child smiled. The wind felt something strange. Not sadness, not joy, something in between. The bittersweet wonder of being noticed by someone who doesn't quite understand what they're hearing, but wants to. The wind let a single phrase slip from the violin, just a soft trill, a whisper of what had filled the attic hours earlier. The sound drifted out the window like a feather on air. The child turned to follow it, slowly, step by step. And though the wind didn't know it yet, that sound would stay with the child, through dinner, through dreams, maybe even into grown-up years. A half-remembered melody that would come back when the world was quiet. A song with no name but endless familiarity. The wind pulled back, returning to the violin. They were not alone anymore. Down below, someone had heard. The attic, once only for silence, had reached beyond its walls. The wind gave a soft, contented sigh. It would play again, but not now. For now, it simply rested its breath on the strings. And the world listened. Evening crept in slow as honey. The golden light thinned into amber, then into blue. Shadows stretched long and lazy across the attic floor. The violin sat quietly in its corner, touched now by moonlight instead of sun, and the wind returned once more, cooler now, tinged with night. Tonight the wind brought no rush, no playful swirls, no bright trills, just a soft presence, like a friend easing into a familiar chair. The violin welcomed it without sound, needing no warm-up, no coaxing. The wind rested a hush across the strings, and a low, slow melody began to form. This was not the waltz. This was not the bright little lullaby from the papers. This was something new, something slower, deeper. A song for the evening. The wind shaped it carefully. The notes lingered, each one taking its time. The violin answered with warmth in its wood. Soft vibrations that pulsed like a heartbeat. Together, they filled the attic with a sound that felt like a memory being written in real time. Below, the house listened again. Floorboards creaked in rhythm. Curtain breathed in and out. Even the moths that fluttered near the bulb paused, hovering in time to the song. The wind moved only where necessary, careful not to disturb the spell. And the music told a story. Not of grand adventures or noble battles, but of quiet endurance. Of something old and worn still choosing to sing. It was a hymn to patience. A lullaby for the forgotten. The attic glowed in the soft blue light, not with brilliance, but with presence. And as the final note faded into the folds of night, the wind didn't chase it. Simply let it go. Some songs don't need to be remembered, only heard. Outside, the night deepened into velvet. Stars pricked the sky one by one, like notes on a dark staff. The moon climbed slowly above the rooftops, casting a silver glow through the attic's dusty window. Inside all was still, all but the cat. She had climbed the creaky shingles with the indifference only cats possess. A silent prowler of gutters and tiles, she paused just outside the window, her green eyes narrowing at the sound she'd heard earlier. Not the wind, no, she knew that. But the other thing, that strange vibrating hush. She crept closer. Inside, the violin rested, quiet for now. The wind hovered nearby, half asleep itself, weaving lazy loops through the air like a lullaby that had forgotten its ending. And then the wind noticed the cat. It nudged the curtain, revealing her silhouette, tail high, ears forward, as if waiting for permission. The wind didn't mind. With a soft breath, it rolled a gentle tone across the strings, just a single note drawn long and low. The violin responded immediately, not startled, not forced, just awake. The cat's ears twitched. She stepped forward on the windowsill, now fully lit by moonlight. She didn't leap inside. She didn't pounce. She simply sat and listened. The wind offered a second note, then a third. The violin matched its energy, a slow, deliberate pulse like footsteps on soft ground. Together they played. Not a song now, but a lull. A rhythm meant only for those willing to pause. The cat blinked long and slow. And for a few minutes, the attic was a concert hall with a single audience. She stayed until the melody ended. And when she finally leapt down and disappeared into the shadows, the wind felt oddly honored. Some listeners never clap. They just remember. The wind stirred as midnight neared. It drifted low, slower now, tracing the violin's curves with a reverence that came not from novelty, but from trust. Their connection no longer needed testing or coaxing. They simply existed together like old friends who could share silence without discomfort. And in that silence, the house began to respond. First it was subtle, a groan from a timber beam that matched the violin's hum, a tiny creak in the rafters that kept time with the wind's rhythm. Even the floor beneath the violin vibrated gently, not from movement but from memory. The wind paused near the trunk where the old ballet shoes still rested. It brushed one, and the ribbon fluttered softly. No music came from the shoes, of course, but the wind imagined footsteps, slow and graceful, moving across the dusty boards. It blew toward the concert programs next. Eleanor Gray. Name. Her handwriting on the corner of the music sheets. Perhaps it had been her song all along. Perhaps it still was. The wind returned to the violin and gave it breath, soft and slow. The violin responded not with a melody, but with something even older. Tone. One pure held note, deep and warm. The kind of sound that wraps itself around the ribs and lingers in the lungs. The kind that says, I remember. And in that note, the attic awakened. Not with brightness, not with fanfare, with presence, as if the walls, the beams, the floor, all of them had leaned in to listen, as if they too had once danced, once loved, once lived through music. And now, after all this time, they had found their rhythm again. The house didn't speak, but it hummed. Night wrapped the attic in its softest blue. The wind, no longer playful, moved like a hush between breaths, didn't swirl or dart, simply was present, attentive, listening. The violin sat in stillness too, not silent, but quiet in the way old trees are quiet, full of sound if you know how to hear it. The wind passed gently across the strings, coaxing a few low notes, like a question asked in the dark. The violin answered with a sigh. Not a sad sigh, no. Contented one. The kind that comes when something once lost is found again. Not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece. Its body vibrated with warmth, not from sunlight or touch, but from memory. The wind drifted through the room like a slow tide, brushing every object now with gentle purpose. The shoes, the music sheets, a mirror, each stirred slightly, as if waking from a long dream, unsure of what was real and what was remembered. The notes that followed were faint, not because they lacked strength, but because they didn't need to be loud. They were for the attic, for the violin, for the wind. A melody emerged. Simple, circling, soft. It repeated once, then again, just barely changing. Like the sound of someone humming as they tidy. Familiar, intimate, sacred. And for a moment, it didn't matter how many years had passed. It didn't matter who had left or why. In that attic, under moonlight, with nothing but breath and string and time, something had returned. Not youth, not perfection, but music. And music, even played to dust and wood and shadow, is never wasted. The wind knew that now. And so did the violin. The wind moved closer now, not to examine, but to embrace. It pressed itself against the violin like a lullaby wrapping a child. The strings, worn but willing, quivered with the contact. Together they breathed in rhythm, neither leading nor following. Duet at last. The attic didn't creak anymore. It resonated. Every corner, every crack in the beams, every forgotten object contributed its silence to the sound. And in return, the wind and the violin filled that silence with softness. They played, not to impress, not to perform, but to exist, fully, presently, and without shame. The notes were slow now, long and graceful, as if each one were being carved into the air. They bent gently in the middle, rising and falling like waves. The violin's voice, once uncertain, now rang out like it had always been there, just waiting for someone to ask. And the wind asked with every breath. It no longer needed to guess how the strings might respond. Knew. They had learned each other's timing, each other's hesitations. There was no force between them, only agreement. And in this quiet trust, they built something beautiful. Not flashy, not grand, just beautiful. Outside, the moon cast silver light across the rooftops. A few clouds drifted lazily, their edges glowing like softened lace. Below, the village slept, unaware that above them, in a crooked old attic, two unseen companions were sharing a final song. Not an ending, not quite, but a pause. The wind slowed. The violin let its final note trail into the rafters. They did not speak. They did not need to. The air itself remembered the tune now. The wind curled near the violin one last time that night. No more music now. Just breath. Just presence. The strings had stilled, their vibrations fading into the attic's wooden bones. But the silence was no longer cold or forgotten. It was full. The kind of silence that follows something sacred. The wind hovered, quiet. It looked once more at the violin, not as an object, but as a companion. The marks on its body, the faint scratches on the back, the worn edge near the chin rest. All scars of being loved, of being used, of being needed. And now once again heard. The wind turned toward the window. The moon had risen high, casting a path of silver across the floor. It illuminated the dust motes like stars. Everything glowed in the hush of night. And so the wind played one final note. Just one. Round. Gentle as a whisper spoken through a memory. The violin answered. Not with volume, not even with sound, but with resonance. That last note hung in the air longer than any before, as if the attic itself was reluctant to let it go. The beams, the floorboards, the old concert programs, they all held their breath with it. And when it finally faded, it left a hush so complete, it felt holy. The wind didn't need to stay. Its part was finished. It drifted toward the window again, brushing the violin one last time as it passed. Farewell, not a goodbye. Because the wind would return, maybe tomorrow, maybe another time. But now it left the attic in stillness. Not the stillness of emptiness. The stillness of something fulfilled. The attic stood silent under the weight of dawn. The stars had faded, and the moon was sinking behind the hills. A soft pink seeped into the sky, like the first brushstroke of a watercolor morning. The wind was gone now, vanished into valleys and branches below, off to chase rivers and rooftops elsewhere. But the attic was not empty. The violin remained, nestled in its quiet corner, bathed in the cool light of early day. Though untouched, it felt somehow different now, as if its very shape had shifted, more proud, more awake, not because it had been fixed, but because it had been heard. The walls remembered, the floor remembered, the old chair, the mirror, even the crooked curtain. They had all borne witness to the return of something long buried, not just sound but meaning, presence, purpose. Below, the house slumbered, but a new hush filled the air. Not dusty silence, not neglect, peace. The violin did not hum. It didn't need to. Music was no longer something it played. It was something it held, in its curves, in its scars, in the breath that once danced across its strings. It would sit here again day after day, quiet and patient, waiting not for fingers or bows, but for the breeze, for the breath of something gentle enough to listen. The wind would return. It always did. And when it did, the attic would stir again, not to remember the past, but to make something new. Because even forgotten things, cracked, dusty, weathered, can sing again. Sometimes they just need someone who's willing to ask and listen. So now the attic sleeps. The violin rests in silence, not abandoned, but at peace. Its strings still, its wood warm from memory. The wind, long since gone, may be curling through tree branches or brushing against window panes far away. But a part of it lingers here, tucked into the corners of the room like the last notes of a lullaby. And that's the thing about music. Even when it stops, it doesn't disappear. It settles into the quiet. Wait. It hums softly beneath the floorboards of thought. A song once heard is never truly lost. It becomes part of the place, part of the person, part of the moment that held it. The dust has settled again, sure. The light dims as the sun gently rises beyond the roofline. But this silence, it's a good one. The kind that comes after something beautiful, when nothing more needs to be said. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let your breath match the hush of the attic, slow and calm. There is nothing else to chase tonight. No more notes to play. Only the gentle truth that even in stillness, even in things forgotten, there is worth and there is wonder. So drift, dear dreamer. Let the quiet take your hand. And if you ever hear a faint melody on the breeze, you'll know it came from somewhere that still remembers how to sing. Sweet dreams.